already starts. Alright. So while waiting for is government team now complete? Let's confirm.
Hello, sorry, but we're still waiting for one more member, but she's on her way. I think nag-refresh lang ng app.
Alright. Uh, I'll just bump the speaking order, please, in the text chat. And I'll also enforce the mandatory disconnection timer rule. So I think it's already 1:46, so 5 minutes. 1:51. So if by 1:51 they're still not here, unfortunately you need to continue. So probably one of your member might need to do iron. All right, I already see three Vinsons. So does that mean government is already complete?
Yes, sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries. Okay, few reminders before we start the round. First thing, mandatory POI. Definition of mandatory if there's more than two repeated POI. So if there's already three above, I'm forced to cut off the speaker to take. So I don't want to interrupt your flow as well. So make sure to take one as much as possible. Second thing, I'll be putting timestamps in the text chat, particularly first, fifth, sixth, seventh. But make sure to also have your personal timer. And I want to note that they may not be that accurate considering I'll be doing notes as well. So yeah, without further ado, debating the motion about COP. Prime Minister, you're here.
Hi, is this clear?
Yep, audible.
Great. POI's to voice will take you before my second argument. When your role models do not do their job, then it is about time that you actually resist against them. A few pieces of framing. Number one, what is the COP? Notice that firstly, this is the Conference of Parties where climate change actions are discussed within several UN nation states. This is where policies like the Cancun and Kyoto initiatives were made. But secondly, I think the paternal role and the paternal objective of this initiative is to obviously be the beacon of hope for climate change all around the world. Second, what is our standard for regret? I'm going to make this clear. You regret something when an initiative has failed to hold corporations accountable and when it has failed to protect the most vulnerable actors of the world. But secondly, is if the initiative has failed to execute its mere paternal role. Two discussions in government. One, I'm going to talk about why the COP has failed in the retrospect, hence the necessity to actually regret it. But secondly is, in the best case of opposition, why we still win. The first discussion is why the COP has failed. Let us look in the retrospect, in the distant past and in the past in general. Despite the discussions done in the COP, such as the implementation or the agreement of the Kyoto Protocol, notice that climate change efforts after that initiative did not work still in the status quo because of the following competitive reasons. Number one, the COP has been too charitable to corporations. This is to say that they still put up loads of carbon emissions. Companies like Amazon Incorporated still continue to operate with so much pollutive harms, for example, in the US. These companies are also tied to their nation states who do not have enough checks and balances and regulations that were supposed to be already present and implemented by the Paris climate agreement, for example, that was supposedly done by the COP. The second level is that millions of marginalized individuals on the ground are still harmed by the rapid rise of carbon emission waste in the Philippines, for example, or the continuous deforestation projects in Brazil. But number three, I think developing nations are still bullied towards the policies of the COP. That is to say that developing nations, like countries in Southeast Asia, are still often put in the pedestal for not improving their green initiatives, rather than the COP actually helping them to alleviate their costs or whatnot. These are the three inefficiencies that the COP has, and that the COP therefore has tolerated capitalism and has downplayed individuals who are affected by climate change on the ground. This just tells you how incompetent and how ineffective the policies are in the COP. This is why we ought to regret it. We regret something then again if it has failed to do its mere objective. This is why in the world of government, right? I think it's just right for us to regret these institutions that were supposed to be the beacon of hope but did not deliver. Before anything else, I think the POI.
So you think that the Pan-American deals with like multiple nations trying to address the environment has been much more effective because somehow, some way, these smaller nations were able to challenge America if your mechanism is too tied to nation states and are being charitable to like corporations. Why is it better on your side?
Notice that the comparative here is that when you regret something, you're obviously going to give so much backlash and criticism against the COP, which I'll discuss then in my next discussion. I'm going to answer the POI here. The conclusion in this argument is simple. The COP has failed in the retrospect, and it is just right for us, right, for individuals and for nation states at large who were dependent on the objective of the COP. It's just right for us to regret it at some point or right now. But secondly is why the regret pushes for more forms of accountability. Here's where I take opposition at their best, and we're gonna engage. Probably opposition is going to say that the COP is the best actor to forward green initiatives and goals to UN nations. Therefore, regretting them is not necessary and it will be counterproductive anyway. Sure. Actually, we concede to the obligations that the COP has and its paternal role at the point in which opposition is still willing to be apologetic of them, despite the retrospective failures that I have discussed and proven in my first argument. On both worlds, understand, Chair, that the COP has already failed as proven, right? But in opposition's world, the behavior of failure and incompetence will continue to push through because of the following structural reasons. Number one, there is no social pressure from movements to actually put the COP into question. The comparative here is that absent the regret and opposition, there's literally no incentive or no other things. There are no movements or no other powers, for example, that want to question the establishment of the COP. It's of course you don't regret it. In fact, you celebrate it, right? But secondly, there's no internal pressure from nation states in the UN, for example, to actually follow up in the effectivity of the COP initiatives. Insofar as the comparative in opposition is that you obviously want to celebrate it, you obviously want to be apologetic of it. In short, pressure and accountability is obviously absent in to the COP, for example, in the world of UP, insofar as the larger society does not regret the establishment of it. And here's the clear comparative, Chair. I think here's the complete comparative. The question now is, how do we fix the problem that the COP has? How do we fix the problematic and systematic issues of the COP? We fix this if we regret the establishment of it. And the mechanism for regretting is simple. Number one, the regret means that green movements are more likely to lobby and highlight the failures of the COP. That is to say that because the regret is there's more incentive for green movements and for people on the ground who were affected by the failures of the COP to actually speak up, to actually say that the COP is a failure, the COP has not improved my daily living or what have you. This means that there is so much. This means that we're able to gather this kind of bargaining power when you allow the society to regret the establishment of the COP. And it's only exclusive on our side, insofar as we do not celebrate it, insofar as we are not apologetic to it. But the second piece of analysis here is that the regret means that the United States nations, for example, who obviously were the stakeholders of the COP initiatives, will be more likely to be skeptical and continue to question the initiative of the COP to the point in which the COP is more incentivized to be consistent to its calls. This is obviously true because the incentive of the UN is to retain its member states. The moment to retain its member states, in opposition, where obviously most of these developing nations or most of these UN states have been failed by the COP, for instance, I think the more that you put the COP in the light or the more that you put the COP in the pedestal, you're more like there's more bargaining power for a lot of these nation states that were not like helped by the COP initiatives to actually call the COP out, to actually tell the UN body that hey, we're still not being helped. For example, we still don't see enough green initiatives. We still don't have like so much bargaining power against so many things in the world. And that's precisely the reason why we fix that, right? Because present the regret, UN nations are likely to speak up to actually question these things and actually not be apologetic at all. What have I given you? I think firstly, I've discussed the retrospective failure of the COP, and that is principally enough to regret it. But secondly, is the pragmatics, why the regret is much more better if you still believe in opposition's framing that COP is better. For all of these reasons, propose.
All right. Thank you for that speech, Prime Minister, to introduce the clash, calling on leader of opposition.
Wait. Give us 10 seconds to set up. Thank you.
Hello, am I audible?
Yep, audible.
All right. Hi, I'll be Adrian. I'll be LO. Yes, your chat, and I'll be recording the speech. So if you're going to raise a POI, kindly take note. It probably will be in the recording. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Without the staunch opposition of Gabriel Boric from Chile, then China would probably still be lambasting the Pacific, impacting their waters because they have no control over these big polluters in the first place. Responses. They say that the COP has failed. First, they need to prove the comparative. It is important to take note, Chair, that the COP has failed not necessarily because they were incompetent, but because nations themselves are so stubborn not to follow the goals that were outlined to them in the first place. Government needs to prove why fragmented and smaller initiatives would necessarily coerce nations to do better when they are inherently smaller in number, they have less capital, they have less manpower, they have lesser capacity to implement efficient policies in the first place. I want to frame this debate in a couple of ways. First, the COP was born out of a desire for a more cohesive action against climate change in order to streamline and augment the fight against climate change. Kyoto and Paris agreements were made to ensure that the plans are being followed. So literally, the Kyoto Protocol is what placed the burden on developing states, like calling out China and the United States for not being able to match what the COP requires of them. This is a progressive policy by nature. This was launched to counter the strength and dominance of big states like the US that has long been the hegemons that prioritized corporate interests over any move to address climate change inherently. Germany literally cites the COP agreements that the US and China are not abiding by, and without these agreements in the first place, you have no incentive to call them out. The point of these protocols is to place the burden on the developed nations who have the capacity, who are more capable because they have more capital, who should be the ones who are more accountable. The counterfactual on Gov actually looks like this. First, the environmental efforts are now fragmented. The level of messaging is splintered, which is bad because not everyone can scrutinize it. You do not have a public voice that is recognized to be legitimate by the United Nations. You do not have the benefit of having people opting in. Second, you do not have you need to have global messaging so people can take it seriously, as opposed to smaller nations having their own talks as to how they execute the policy individually. What is the trade-off we are willing to take? Sure, maybe in some instances, the developing nations are sacrificing more of their economic development for environmental pledges. But we think that is a minute harm relative to the benefits they will reap. The standard for regret is simple, and I do not think PM was able to explain this well. One, we ask if the creation of COP has done more harm and that the comparative of Gov is better in comparison. Two, we ask if the principles it supports outweigh some of the principles that we trade off. Argument one. Why is the COP the best one to act for environmental policy? First, examine the comparative, right? In Gov, there are no comparatively large agreements transcending between nations that place burdens on big polluters like the US and China. So if you can prove that absent the COP, you have very little incentive to burden push US and China, then you win the debate. Gov needs to prove that the COP's existence is so abhorrently wrong that their existence inherently should be regretted. But if I prove that this is only the delta for which we can gain even some level of benefit for developing nations, and get some accountability placed on these big polluters, that's still far better off. Second, the COP simply has a massive reach to the extent that it has a much larger base for which it can operate on. Note that the COP isn't just some random org, right? It's not like the International Society of Biology. It's literally a UN ratified institution that has the support of 193 countries. That's huge. You don't get that much support in random policies or treaties, which means that the fact that you have gained the leverage of some support means that the COP has some legitimacy to the countries that are in it, including big polluters like bingo, US and China. You have individual policies on Gov because your environmental summits are fragmented. You have individual countries having internal consultations, which is good on principle, sure, but the extent will never manifest. Before the Kyoto Convention was made, if we buy GovBench, the hundreds of environmental protection meetings in Indonesia should have preserved their coral reefs. They should have banned the oil spills from wreaking havoc in Sumatra waters. But in Gov, domestic policy simply was insufficient because they don't hold the big polluters accountable. In Gov, China will have no barrier that prevents them from going into the oceans because at least now in status quo, even if China has some hegemony over the Southeast Asian nations, we are biting our worst case. They are barred by the Paris Agreement from dumping their smoke into Taiwan Strait because it violates the principle of the convention. Sure, we can have the Philippine DENR or the Ministry of Environment in Indonesia having internal agreements, but the reach of these policies will never be enough because the issue is more than because big polluters exacerbate it further. But also three, this is how you place accountability on the big polluters who should necessarily be given the burden anyway. No, thank you. The reason why Indonesians have begun to migrate into Tangerang is because Java and Sumatra are bearing the brunt of climate change by sinking down, low tide, and facing massive extinction of endemic species. Sure, you do lose the domestic effect because the state can only impose policies that affect their own people. And obviously, no state policy can ever return these extinct species back. But more importantly, the impact is just terrible on Gulf because you're not holding accountable the polluters like China and Iran for the reason why you have this problem in Sumatra to begin with. Let me be comparative with their very best case. In Gulf, Pan-American or Pan-African summits can still be possible. Sure. But even if you still collaborate with other countries proximate to you, you still have no capacity to call out the United States when the stakeholders have unipolar power. This is crucial because
Yeah.
Africa championed for environmental policies before Kyoto and Cancún Agreements. No, thank you. But their voices were never really heard until the UN collectively met during the COP. It was only when Fumio Kishida supported Japan's stance to support these developing countries by capital that any change actually accrued for terrible fossil fuels in Japan because China doesn't want to lose its trade partner Japan. Its agreement with the COP forces to comply. Lastly, then, before I take that POI, without the COP, even if there is political will to prioritize the environment, there is no incentive from a regulating body to force the states to care. So the US has no incentive to act on Gulf. China will still be stealing precious oil from Sudan and Nigeria to produce the same smog. That is the reason why Lagos in Nigeria is facing massive water crises. There will still be massive detrimental effects if you don't force the big polluters to have the agency to act. Go, POI. Where's my
Name
water?
a single country that has achieved the emission goals of COP.
Japan, I think Indonesia right now because China is not violating it. I think it was quite well explained. Argument 2. This is the most democratic approach to developing nations. First, I want to outline how exactly these organizations work. The UN is democratic by nature because they're composed of different member states. This is because you allow the voice of everyone who is involved, but sure, we accept the trade-off that probably it's the Netherlands presides the meeting at first. But the moment when they agreed with Kyoto, the agreement explicitly stated that you prioritize those in the fringes, which means that the COP inherently prioritizes developing nations entirely because they recognize that they are the ones who are in need. This is the case because they know the massiveness of climate change. If they place the burden on these countries, they know that these countries are not as capable. So everyone will be worse off because rising global temperatures literally can potentially affect Europe as well. But because they know how proximate this is to developing nations more, they prioritize them. Note that I've proven that even if they are selfish actors, which is the very worst case, the incentive to not suffer the same fate in the future is so large. It's the biggest push for them to prioritize these countries first. All of this means by statutory policy, they're actually democratic. Second, you do not leave the voices of developing nations because one, you have public buy-in. The legitimacy is contingent on whether the hundreds of developing nations like Brazil agree with your policy. Two, it's far easier to implement this if you have a chance to execute it in a collective nature. Three, discourse is just far more likely to happen. You have multiple countries collaborating and discussing it. Very proud to oppose this motion. Upwinds.
All right. Thanks for that speak leader of opposition to support the case for Gulf defeat.
Hello, can I confirm if I'm heard?
Yep, you're
Hello.
audible.
Okay. Hi, name is Adrian. Pronounce him. T and him. POIs through the voice. I'll try to take one after fifth. But before protected time, I think there's a mandatory POI rule. Raise it once, I'll be sure to take one. Don't worry. Right. Setting up my timer. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. Ops case is so perfect that it sounds so wrong. Because if it was that good, then maybe temperature and sea level shouldn't be one of our concerns. We should be able to call out developed nations, for example, for environmental harms, historic environmental harms, for example. The environment should have improved from the time the establishment of the COP. It has not, and it will never be. Hence, we regret the establishment of COP. We think that the UN will still exist, so China can't go to wherever border they say. In fact, that burden still exists on OP because they have no clear mechanism to how they prevent that because COPs are not on that metric. But it's just more terrible on OP since COP caters to nation states they are affiliated with, meaning the where their funds are coming from and stuff like that. But I want to flag that Gov only needs to prove why in principle the regret is legitimized, and absent the establishment of COP, there could have been a better alternative to a climate change solution. Two things in my speech then. First will be a response to an isolated response to the bulk of previous speaker. Second, I'll be extending 3 things. One, the lack of corrective mechanism we have in status quo. Second, greenwashing in status quo. 3, voices of the developing countries not being heard because of the creation. First then, government is contingent on their case on that COP is the best body to regulate climate change solution. First of all, there was no clear mechanism to how they say this. They just say that because certain things because certain protocols were happening, but this was not enough to push their burden, which was higher because they had to engage that these protocols were enough to for example sanction individuals or to be able to hold individual states accountable. They don't prove that. But second, it's not a real body. COP is not a real body. It's just a convention. You can't shame. You can't impose environmental law, for example. The real role of COP is to just be there, to have a global effort to save climate change. It's false matter from up. Because if we could do that, then why was Germany and US not called out back then? It was the fact that their jurisdiction, the COP jurisdiction and goals allow for the lack of accountability
UI.
to continue. But then they say at least it keeps people aware and that there's a global push. We then question that awareness because COP is a business enterprise on how you can more likely maintain the system of abuses. There is the type of awareness create is still far worse. Therefore, ops case don't work. No impact should be credited from them. Why was John so debate winning? First, on to the standard of regret. That if COP has failed in retrospect, we think that the regret happens with the success of establishing COP, meaning that the regret is on the people who allowed COP to happen. If we base it on that standard, John was so debate winning because he was able to prove the incentive and the retrospective harms of absent the establishment of COP, there could have been a better alternative, which I will prove later on. But Elo has never explained it up how they solved the regret and how they still have to explain when establishment of COP was the best alternative you could have had. Second, how does the COP look like in status quo? I'm not gonna say this like I'm demonizing COP because it is a matter of fact. I think that the COP was created alongside the UN for global initiatives. The main goal of COP is to have a global approach to solving climate change, which their notable push is to lessen carbon emission and the usage of fossil fuels, for example. When you look at it historically, they failed from reaching that goal, lowering emissions, lowering the use of fossil fuels. COP demands for every nation then, and that's problematic in a way because COP demands for every nation belonging to the Commission, for example, to have lesser emissions, which is historically unjust because they are not countries who push for larger emissions, but these are also countries that are not doing the most they are doing the most emissions because of the imperialist state systems in SQ. Third, then, how does the world look like absent COP? We think that the counterfactual exists, that there is a higher pressure for the UN and other bodies to impose laws because they want to maintain the kind of power they have. And this is essentially powerful since at the time of establishment of COP, bodies like the UN was still not legitimately a powerhouse, meaning at that point in time, pressure would have been enough to push them into creating a more sustainable model of supply and demand, for example, and other more tangible solution. Even if you don't buy this counterfactual, even if it's fragmented as what Hello said, it's fine because there's still a call for climate justice, because there is still environmental movements within the state, and there is still a local push for change in the system, meaning it is likely that the Philippines can say that they don't want to have imperialist ties with the US, for example, and they don't want to be over-consuming or giving land to foreigners to build their factories on.
Good point.
Before I proceed to extension, I'll take the point.
Every system of states, whether democracies, autocracies, or socialism, has failed at one point. Should we just regret all of them and say anarchy is the best idea? But that also failed as well.
No, that's not the whole point of government bench. We're saying that because of the establishment of COP, that leads to this form of solution mismatch we have today, that we can solve climate change with just doing less commercial or less carbon emissions and stuff like that. We know that that's not the problem, that we have to fix the system. And it's the same establishment of the COP that has allowed for individuals, for example, to not be able to question that, to still continue over consuming or whatever. It's the fact that there could have been a higher pressure for COPs, for example, for university, the UN, for example. First extension then, that there was an ineffective environmental solution, and it's still happening today and stuff like that. Because even if every single country follows the goals of COP, it still would not be enough to be sustainable for us to change climate change, or for us to be still be able to stay in Earth for X number of years. We think that climate change happens because of current world models like capitalism and liberalism, not just emission. It's a system of consuming, and it's the fact that COP goals and jurisdiction has allowed for the lack of accountability there is, because it's not a real body. You can't put someone a certain state in jail, for example, or sue them and stuff like that, because the COP is just literally there to have a global initiative, and it creates this ineffective solution to climate change, because absent the regret, there's then no incentive for COP to be better. Second, we think that it has allowed for greenwashing to happen in status quo. I think that the creation of the COPs in coordination with UN, for example, I think that there's an incentive to push for overconsumption and stuff like that, something that the UN the UN supporters, the state supporters probably need. But then we think that there has been pushes in green deals and stuff like that, and these are the foundation of how greenwashing started in the first place. I think that things like greenwashing happened because of COP, in Germany, but also it has allowed other more models that are along the standards that still allow you to pollute. For example, in Germany, where they wanted to cut down on fossil fuels, but they still use coal, for example, to cut down on emissions, which was problematic since it doesn't really solve climate change. You don't have to forward politics and narratives then to solve climate change. But I think that this is the point in time that the COP has created. So that's why we're unable to go fix climate change further. Third, then we think that developing nations are not heard because there's more bureaucracy and stuff like that. For all these proposed things.
All right. Thank you for the speech, UPM, calling now DLO.
Wait, should I'm currently at 7%. Give me time to. I'll just charge my laptop. Oops, I'll just turn off the cam first. Before I start, can I just confirm that I'm clearly audible?
Yep, audible and visible.
Thank you. PUIs on the chat. Again, PUIs on the chat. Pronouns he or him, or they or them. And POIs on the chat. I'll take you. Please don't badger me. there is one key issue in this debate, and that is which alternative is much more feasible and which alternative is a better solution in the fight of climate change. Let's analyze government bench contribution in this debate. The first thing that they claim is that COP has failed because they are too charitable on cooperation. First response is that if you analyze this argument coming from Prime Minister, they are implicitly conceding that they prefer a more radical, far-left environmental solution. You need to believe this because they have characterized the COP as too moderate, as not too radical. So therefore, if you want to credit the benefits coming from government bench, you need to believe that they need to defend a radicalized method in the fight of climate change. What does this look like then? This looks like imposing draconian measure against multinational corporation, which looks like overly punishing corporation, which looks like massively redistribution the income within the economy and so on. These are things that are very, very huge to take upon. Given that this is their likely counterfactual, which they conceded, I think that this concession coming from Prime Minister means that they need to defend this counterfactual. Why then is this clear counterfactual of radical solution much more harmful? There are two pieces of analysis. Firstly, this counterfactual is simply infeasible or cannot happen within the first day, at the end of the day, because it is too difficult to do, especially considering the massive trade-off that radicalist approach require in the first place, like massively reforming the internal structure of corporation or imposing too much on corporation to the point that it is against their profit incentive, because radicalized solutions require a full-on transformation and a full-on reform to the point that it is invasive to the internal dynamics of corporation, which you are heavily stepping on the shareholders under the role of government bench. So therefore, corporations are likely to do three things. Firstly, they are likely to go against the movement because you are directly attacking their legitimacy. You're directly questioning their sense of legitimacy within the public consciousness because you are directly antagonistic towards them. So therefore, you don't get them under your side of the house because you only radicalize and you only polarize the divide between large corporation who controls the narrative, who controls the resources, than the behalf of the movement. But the second reason as to why it's bad is because this counterfactual is simply infeasible. Because the first reason, the second thing that they are likely to do is that they are likely to withdraw from certain nations with radicalized framework because the potential risks are too much. Note that the only reason why corporations enter developing nations, emerging economies, is because of the free market policy that you are able to give them the autonomy to operate. But the third thing that they are likely to do is that if they don't withdraw at all, their longevity is likely to be harmed, which leads to inefficiency, which leads to financial bankruptcy. So therefore, you breed massive unemployment, lack of goods and services, and lessen the investor confidence within developing nations, because that country now becomes a red flag given the counterfactual of government bench. Why then is this important within the debate? Note that this debate is not only about the environment. Like, I know the team is environment, but we can talk about other impacts that are also important within the debate. This is how we talk to you that this impacts the people on the ground, which means that you breed massive economic harms on the people on the ground because now corporations are risk averse with radical solution that they want to defend. But the second thing, so therefore the conclusion of the first part is that you are likely to fuck over the workers, which desperately need to put food on the table because you necessarily push corporations away, and these people within developing nations need them the most. Because I don't care about climate change. If I die right now because of starvation, for example, because of unemployment, that is something that you should care about because those types of impacts are on your hands. The second reason as to why it's bad is because if they want a radicalized approach, you do not get any public buy-in at all from the global community. Notice, radicalized solutions are deeply looked down upon because far-left values are associated to be too extreme, which is why in most polarized democracy, like United States, for example, the Green Party is the laughingstock of the politics. The reasoning here is quite simple. Firstly, radical far-left solutions are associated with communism, especially with the fall of Soviet Union during the Cold War. So therefore, most Western states that are too polar opposite with far-left values like democracy are likely to demonize these values. But secondly, radicalized solution can only be afforded by the privileged. Look at the Green New Deal within the United States, where it aims to radically reform the economy of the United States to make it quote-unquote eco-friendly. So this means that it paints radical environmental solution to to be out of touch of reality because it will come to at the expense of the short-term priorities of the poorest of the poor, which means that you don't get any public support at all because you antagonize the people who do not want this type of things because they do not have the financial capacity to handle the shocks. What then is a clear margin and what is a clincher here? Firstly, their counterfactual is bad because there's no feasibility at all. Even if our counter policy is soft, that's better because we're doing something as opposed to no public buy-in at all. Secondly, short-term needs are just more important because these are things that already impacts you. Climate change, you can still wait another year before you drown from the rising sea levels. But if you don't have food on the table, you'll probably die on the next few days. So therefore, our benefits are just more analytical power than them. But moreover, I want to add something here. Prioritizing the short term is beneficial because if you are able to prioritize the people on the ground by giving them income, by giving them food on the table, they are able to think about the long-term implication as well, which is why you make people care about the environment in a point of which you don't fuck over them. So therefore, why then is the comparative better? Before that, I'll take that BOI now.
We never said that the counterfactual was radical pushes. It's the pressure for UN to be better. It's the shift of power. But even if you don't buy this, we said that domestic jurisdictions are better because you can impose environmental laws better.
Like, that's just a lie. Because like your burden is debate is to regret COP in its whole. Like, who the hell told you that scrutiny of the COP cannot happen under opposition? Obviously, scrutiny can also happen. UN is democratic. People have a say. Like, what? So yeah, I want to go to the comparative. So why is the comparative then better? The comparative is better because COP is, if we believe coming from Prime Minister, is too charitable corporation, that's fine because at least you are able to create public support from the environmental causes because most individuals right now are not willing to sacrifice their short-term needs for the environment. So therefore, under government, we create a false dichotomy. It's either you support environment causes or you are evil because you subscribe to capitalism. It is better in the comparative of because we appease the short-term and the long-term needs of individuals, which therefore means that you get more public support under our comparative because we don't push people away. Like, the PO doesn't make sense because coming from Prime Minister, they were like, oh, we need radical solution. Obviously, that's their counterfactual. You guys said it yourself. So therefore, the last thing that they say is that we want scrutiny, COP, never proving why it's exclusive under the regrets debate. They need to regret it entirely because check and balances can still happen. Like, other people that are developing nations can have their own say because UN is democratic. Developing nations that are being fucked over can unify, can collectivize in order to have a more bigger voice within the United Nations. So at that point in time, none of their impacts manifest in this debate because we actively proven why their counterfactual, it's either our side or their counterfactual that they need to defend is something that is far more radicalized, that is a worse solution because of the fact that people in the ground hate it so much because you fucked them over because you decided to say that long-term is important than your current needs as a person right now. Thank you.
All right. Thanks for that speech, DLO, to summarize the case for Robert.
Hello, give me a few seconds to set up my timer. All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The reason why opposition will lose this debate and why they will be unable to fulfill their burden is because they do not understand why climate change is such a problem and why it is happening in the first place. It is not because of states. You need to understand that a state is an arbitrary unit in this debate. It's also an arbitrary unit in the real world. States are not the one who put emissions, it's corporations. And if COP was not established, we would not have a framework that ignores the culpability of these corporations, that ignores the direct link between climate change and these multimedia corporations. And they give us a frame that how government is bad because it overly punishes the corporations and it lowers the economy. Well, firstly, we tell you that it's good. This is actually the unique benefit that you get in government. We need to have direct accountability to corporations. Because what does COP looks like? It looks like, okay, China emissions, the US has certain emissions, etc., etc., etc. The problem with COP is that it blankets the real causes of climate change, which are multinational corporations, and they are less likely to pressure those people on their side of the house. And they tell us that, okay, if you pressure corporations, or if you punish corporations and you destroy workers, and developing nations need development because I don't care about climate change, I just want to have food on my table. Notice that the biggest actors damaging our climate is not corporations in developing nations. It's huge multinational corporations like Amazon that already does destroy their workers, even without the impetus of other alternatives. Yes.
So how does your comparative, which is like Pan-American and Pan-African deals, generally target corporations better than, for example, when China, Europe, and US is sitting on the table and people are criticizing them?
It's strange to us that they keep trying to push the counterfactual Pan-American, etc., when that is not the counterfactual that we have been presenting in this debate. We are simply trying to tell you that COP must be rejected on the basis that is ineffective. It provides a faulty framework to climate change, and also because existing and better alternatives exist, which is not at all related to the counterfactual that they've been pushing to us, which is not part of our case at all. Thirdly, on my response is that they tell us that, okay, you antagonize people because of communism, but this antagonism only exists because of the framework that COP produced in the first place, and it is also a basis of why it is important for us to regret this establishment. Because let's look at it retrospectively. COP gave people a flimsy solution to climate change that is aimless, lacking in direction, and that is not directed. Right? It's COP's fault that people do not recognize that it is corporations that are fundamentally at fault in when it comes to climate change. So moving on to the deadlocks in this debate. Firstly, the deadlock here is on pressure. Government tells that, okay, COP is the best because they're able to burden push nations, and you can only get accountability when you have COPs. You can pressure China, you can pressure the US. Well, we tell you this: pressure mechanisms exist outside of COP. What do these pressure mechanisms look like? They look like three things. One is that status principles. Countries want sustainability. Countries want resources. No matter what, even if you don't call it climate change, countries will always want to be able to have resources. And countries, if they can help it, they always want to make sure that their nature is sustainable, because it helps with their economy in the long run. Secondly, is because there are scientists who serve as alarm whistleblowers. And thirdly, are movements within states, which we tell you is an extension from my DPM, which is an important actor in this debate because of three reasons. One, because they are much more effective because there's internal pressure within nation states that can directly, which leads to second reason why, that can directly pressure the real emission criminals, which are corporations. And thirdly, because there's direct accountability to nation states. If you really want to push it, okay, it's the states that can give the most pressure, then we tell you that on our side, you can still get direct accountability to nation states. Why? Because this will actually affect their votes. Because if the large majority of their population disagrees with their policies, then it is more likely for these states to care about that rather than the arbitrary rules of international law. Because what they fail to understand is that international law is fundamentally toothless, and it's not able to hold countries accountable. The pressure that they're talking about is completely imaginary, by the way. It is at most optimistic, and it's the liberal optimism that makes them lose this debate. And if they tell us okay, why are these alternatives enough? Because firstly, it makes it clear who is I won't take one POI, sorry. It makes it clear who is creating these emissions. Again, it's not nations, it's these corporations. Secondly, is that there's actual accountability and consequences to these nation states, i.e. there's better pressure on our side, and i.e. we win this deadlock. But again, let's have a further extension, right? Why is COP not enough? Let's engage with them. Because we need to understand that historically, it just has not been effective. Notice that when I erased the POI, but countries that were able to reach COP goals, big pollution emitters like China or US was unmentioned. Why is this so? Right? What does this say? It says that COP is incredibly easy to opt out of, especially to bigger countries. Firstly, because there is no accountability, that is just the nature of international law. Secondly, is because there's no intervention. And thirdly, because of the arbitrary emission goals. Right? It tells, okay, we need to lower emissions, etc. But then, as the example of my DPM is that, like, for example, in Germany, where they told the world, okay, we lessen our emissions because we cut back on fossil fuels, but then they ended up using coal to replace fossil fuels. So that's an example of how, like, COP goals, like, fundamentally and inherently, this framework does not solve climate change, which leads me to my second deadlock. Where are you able to get better solutions for climate change? Okay, let's use their best case, right? Okay, even if every single country buys into COP, it is still not enough to solve climate change. Why? Because firstly and foremost, as I mentioned unfortunately, is the emphasis on nations and not corporations. Nations is incredibly arbitrary. It is easy to put the real criminals here, which are corporations, under the rug. It is harder for people. It is harder for people to put into accountability the real tangible criminals when it comes to climate change. And secondly, because it does lowering emissions, etc. This metric is easily manipulated, and at best it is virtue signaling at this point, because just because you lower emissions, this is simply not enough. Again, we need a radical change for climate change, which they have to concede is a radical problem. It is something that it is something that you can't just solve by lowering emissions. It's just a faulty metric and a faulty framework when you're trying to solve climate change. Because even if you lower these emissions, it does not mean that it does not mean that you have that you chose alternative methods. It does not mean that it does not mean that a country has been using sustainable methods. And that is why at the end of the day, COP does three things. One is that it blankets these corporations. It protects them. It protects them and does not give proper accountability to the real problem of climate change. And secondly is that it provides a faulty framework of how to solve climate change, because COP is not sustainable. It is at best virtue signaling, and it does not solve the very heart of the faults of climate change. So what happened in this debate? Or why do we win this debate? We tell you we win this debate because opposition was not able to prove to us their burden of why COP is good enough that we do not need to regret it. They failed to prove this for three reasons. One is because they did not tell us why because we told them that COP is ineffective and that is why we should regret it. Secondly, is because their benefits are easily co-optable and mitigated because of additional other actors and actors who are better. And thirdly, because it does not solve the very goal of COP, which is to solve climate change. And with that, we win this debate. Thank you.
Thanks for the speech government rep. Now calling on opposition whip.
Hello. Our whip is currently in the bathroom, so can you guys wait until 30 seconds or something? Thank you.
Yeah, sorry. I think he just went to the restroom, but I think he's walking now.
Hello. So they're back. Just give them 10 seconds to prepare. Thank you.
Sorry, I just came back from this restroom. Okay. Yeah, it's true, guys. Just to clarify, if I'm still audible and visible.
Yep, audible, visible.
Okay. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1, go. For some reason, only multinational COP is the push against climate change on our side. For some reason, magically, local initiatives would be far stronger in their side when they disband COP. For some reason, they can regret the COP without A, making this a retrospective motion, which I don't know is in the Woodsy manual, or B, they say that we regret this COP and also just criticize it because that's how we regret things. Again, they're squirreling this debate panel. The reason why Gov loses this debate is because they don't want to debate the debate. They don't want to debate their side of the debate. There's just been two pretty soft stands, which is why you should take Abed, because Abed built your correct frame for you. Abed built the correct debate for you. And you just say it didn't come from us. But actually, when you look at your premises, you were pretty soft stands. But you already gave us premises saying that, oh, we are too charitable. And that's why we gave you the opposite of that. And you still call us out for putting words into your mouth. Well, we're just trying to help you anyway, right? Two main questions. Firstly, on the principle, and does government even have a principle to begin with? And secondly, on change, and in their case of smokescreen and better pressure. Firstly, on principle, basically what they're saying is COP has failed, therefore we must regret it at the end of the day. But their form of regret, by the way, here, panel, is to call them out. That's their form of regret, like it's a squirrel. 4 responses. Firstly, I think that's just bad logic and it's illogical because I asked them a POI. Democracies has failed, communism has failed, every form of system of government has failed. I'd say families has failed. I don't know, other concepts have failed as well. Can we just say that we'd rather not live in a world that or like regret it just because they have failed at one point? We think that's bad logic to begin with. And I think the standard, therefore, is unfair, which is what I'm proving in this first line of analysis. Unless you believe, panel, that everything should just not exist because every single system of literally everything has failed at one point, then Gov's standard is, not fair. Second, we think it's untrue. It's the nations that failed to achieve the burden of not meeting the quota of COP. Not necessarily that COP has failed because they have already done their job. They have already set their standards. They have already set meetings. They have already set all of this sort of summits in order to stop the fight against climate change. They have summed up these best scientists of the world in order to give the best resolutions and whatnot. But it was the nations themselves that have failed to achieve their job, not necessarily COP. What do these 2 responses of illogical and untrue things means? It means it leads on to my third rebuttal, which means that this is no true principle at all, because this is a principle that is reliant on a certain pragmatic that they have to prove later on, which, as we will tell you later, is either 1, you believe their squirrel version of the motion, or B, you believe in the built motion, the built argument coming from Abed, which is, we tell you, is still far worse off. But fine, even if we finally take the bullet, and this is me being very engaging in my 4th layer of response, the reason why this principle ought to fall is that even if we failed at one point, June gave you the much more fair standards, that this is a question on net good or net harm. Basically telling you that even if we concede to some extent that we have failed and there's a principal liability, it is not enough of a burden for you to completely regret it and live in a world where COP does not exist, because that's a proper debate that we should be debating in this motion. Comparative on our side, what did we tell you? What is the principle that is not reliant on a certain pragmatic? The principle is pretty simple, that developing nations are catered to on our side of the house, and we give you multiple structural reasons to prove that this is true. This is not a proving and pragmatic like, oh, it's possible. We already told you that it has already happened, whether it be the US and China being called out, because big states are generally being targeted in COP meetings because the higher burden is put upon them. What is their main response? Their main response is just to say that, oh, COP panders to these nations. But we gave you factual evidence that this is untrue, and that therefore the principle stands at the end of the day, that out of every other thing, considering nothing else, in terms of principle, our side wins the principle. Just because it failed doesn't mean you ought to regret it. It's an unfair standard. Before I move on to where change is likely to happen, is there any POI? No POIs. Second, in terms of where is change likely to happen, what is their argument here? Now, let's take a look at the 2 comparatives they have. One we built for them, right? The first is to say that we can suddenly pressure them more because this is when we regret it, do we actually have better change? They say that, oh, people are going to be skeptical of the COP when you don't regret it at the end of the day. And in order to say that you can fix it, you have to regret it because this is how you fix it. Panel, that's basically criticizing the COP, which is possible on opposition side of the house. Gov needs to live in a world where the COP doesn't exist at all, and they have to prove that pressure is likely to accrue on their side. I don't understand, therefore, the logic of this nature of why more pressure is more going to exist on their side. Pressure is going to exist on our side because the COP will always be constantly pressured. Who will be pressured on government? I don't know. Pan-American deals where America is the unipolar power? I don't know. Asian deals where China is the unipolar power? See, we already built you a very good comparative, and we'll tell you why it destroys them. Second argument coming from there is that, oh, we regret because the regret forces the push. Again, the first response is that this is a bad faith argument because it squirrels the motion. You have to live in a world where the COP doesn't exist. I don't understand why we're talking about this at WIP to begin with in nationals. But secondly, it's highly illogical for you that you regret the push because at the instance in which you dissolve the biggest bodies, okay, fine, right? Assuming that this is not a world reset, then this is me engaging in all fronts, right? Even if it's against the manual. Assuming that, it's not a world reset and we just abolish the COP or whatnot, I don't understand why the pressure is suddenly there when you necessarily take out the biggest governing body that fights against climate change. It's just completely illogical at this point. Let's now move on to our side since it's 6 minutes and they didn't give us any POI. We told you why it's progressive, why the reach is very good, and why this is the only unique regulatory body to ever exist. What are the responses? They say that, oh, it's not punishing anybody. Oh, internal pressure is not enough. All of these arguments, we are begging them a while ago in our POIs. How do you do it better on your side? They just say that when you regret it, you show this emotion and therefore you get change. But that's not regret, that's criticizing, which again, as I tell you, is not a valid response. But secondly, they say it's a smoke screen. And this is probably their best response. Let me give it to that, right? Because they say that, oh, you put the spotlight onto the countries instead of the corporations. We then ask them, how are you more likely to resolve this on your side, given that these are unipolar efforts on your side, or separate where the US just makes their own policies and whatnot? How can we ensure that there is greater accountability? We don't. But we gave you the mechanisms at June as to why accountability is far better on our side. They didn't give you any mechanisms as to why our side is far better off in terms of regulations, despite being imperfect. Lastly, Abbott gave you multiple reasons as to why the correct argument from Gov is infeasible. They just reject that premise, but in reality, it's the case that they should have run. For all those reasons, vote for the team that actually follows the rules of debate.
All right. Thanks for that speech, Opposition Whip. Calling now Opposition Reply.
Hi, can I be heard?
Yep.
Great. Thank you. Sorry, my speech in a while. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Gov's biggest case is to say that the COP has failed, and hence they must be regretted. I want to call out how Gov here is a bit unclear what their metrics for regret are and what the impacts of such regret will be. We tell you clearly from LO that you can only be legitimately regretted if, one, its policies have inherently led to more harm than good, and two, its principles outweigh whatever thing you have in the world right now. They wanted two things. PM wanted radical solutions. DPM wants to scrutinize the COP, but it still exists. Notice that Ahmed was very charitable by building both cases of the debate. Even assuming the squirreled case coming from DPM, we still prove why we can co-opt the scrutiny. But the whole point is, Gov needs to recognize the trade-off of the case when the COP doesn't exist in its entirety, which is exactly what the standards of regrets debate in the Agents Manual needs them to defend. Gov champions fixing the system, but never actually defends the alternative. If we follow Gov's logic here, then you also regret every single policy attempt because everything has flaws. Gov's policy also regrets the move to impose trade restrictions on China when they polluted Nigeria. You regret the capital support that Japan gave to Taiwan when it needed to cleanse its waters in the Taiwan Strait, which I said at LO. Because the COP forces its signatory states to act. And yes, it includes US and China. The level of support that goes beyond individual nations inherently transcends their individual impetus to decide on their own, because obviously you have much more. 193 versus 1, that's a pretty clear margin. Gov needs to accept that the alternative on their bench is to have no COP acting as a unifying factor among every nation, whether it's a socialist Vietnam or a capitalist Venezuela, because they have no buy-in if the COP is not there. Notice that you necessarily will not get any unifying sense of control on multiple states if you have no COP that unites them. And because these nations that gave these multinational corporations the platform to pollute in the first place means that it's the nations themselves that should be held accountable, which Theo beautifully proves. He proves that there is a need for the COP to exist to ensure that these standards for them to protect the environment can be offset, which is which absent the incentive in Gov because you have no statutory policy that defines it. Because even if the UN exists, the COP statutes don't, right? Hell, the UN even failed when the Cold War ensued because it didn't stop the economic war. But Gov Bench here says, even without the COP, they can co-opt because, hey, at least we have the UN. Bro, if you really want radicalism but also don't want failures, maybe Gov just doesn't want to exist. I didn't know this was a philo debate. Gov is just incapable of adhering to their burden because they want to take every single thing but never resolve how unipolar efforts will ever be better. But we even engage further. Abed clearly proves that radicalization is simply not feasible. On Gov, we prove that corporations will not follow if there is no COP. When the state of Brunei is calling out Ayala malls in the Philippines, there is an impetus to call out the radicalization. So the environmental benefit that Brunei can get is less accessible now because the power imbalance will not be offset by any mechanism at all because you don't have a great extent. Because an idealized world of radicalism will just not accrue, especially when you have multiple worlds in which different states are in. Abid was quite clear that far left values are viewed to be too extreme. He gave you a lot of structural reasons, like it's not tangible to everyone. It's a policy that's forward by the privileged. Only those who have the capacity to handle financial shocks in the first place. So even if this means our policy is less radical, we've proven that it's still good because at least you have the delta of action that gives you some leverage to get action. But even if we buy everything that PM gives, and this is me being very charitable already, they assume the fiat of improvement. Notice that we can co-opt that fiat as well. Gov never proves to you why improvement is inherent to regretting its existence. I'd argue they aren't engaging in the median case that an average reasonable voter would buy. They need to engage with the comparative that you regret the COP in its entirety that Abed was quite clearly proving. Deputy Prime goes and bring the blanket banner. You must target the root cause, the multinational corporations. Big words. Maybe they can squirrel this debate all they want, but we can see through it, unfortunately. If I buy their frame, then capitalism is the root cause. So your solution is to abolish capitalism. I think you know a couple of guys who attempted to do this and they don't exist anymore. Like you can figure what happened to Poland and Hungary.
Hello.
And literally the biggest Soviet Union. So the likelihood that the best case alternative on Gov will accrue is just very, very little. We were quite clear that radicalism will not ensue, even in its best case, because you have less buy-in. That's very bad. Upwind. Sorry.
Yeah. I got disconnected at the start of your reply speech. So I didn't know if anyone noticed. So
Sorry.
yeah, my sister nagalaw ang Wi-Fi, so I got disconnected. So if it's okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, I didn't hear
Start
anything.
to like repeat the reply.
Yeah, of course.
Right.
That's why I
Good
was
luck.
interrupting.
Okay.
Sige.
It's fine.
So you missed out like the entire reply, right?
Yeah, I missed out the entire reply. I didn't know why. No one
Okay.
saw me in the Zoom meeting.
I'm
Pero
sorry.
okay lang.
We're
Sige
sorry.
lang.
Wait, I'll just drink water. Great, I gave 3 speeches to this. It's fine. I'll be starting again in one. Sorry for that. I should have noticed since I'm directly looking at Zoom. Okay.
Yes, timer.
Yeah. Starting in 3, 2, 1. Gov's biggest case is to say that the COP has failed and hence they must be regretted. I want to call out how Gov here is a bit unclear what their metrics for regret are and what the impacts of such regret will be. We tell you explicitly at LO that you can only legitimately regret the COP if 1, its policies have inherently led to more harm than good, and 2, its principles outweigh whatever standards you have right now. Gov wanted 2 things right. First, PM wants radical solutions. Second, DPM wants to scrutinize the COP, but it still exists. Notice that Abed was very charitable by building both cases of the debate. Even assuming the squared case coming from DPM, we still prove why we can co-opt the scrutiny. But the whole point is, Gov needs to recognize the trade-off of the case when the COP doesn't exist in its entirety, which is exactly what the standards of regrets debates in the Asians manual needs them to defend. Gov champions fixing the system, but never actually defended the alternative. If we follow Gov's logic, then you also regret every single policy attempt because everything has flaws. Gov's policy also regrets the move to impose trade restrictions on China when they polluted Nigeria. You regret the capital support that Japan gave to Taiwan when it needed to cleanse its waters in the Taiwanese Strait. I said this at LO because the COP forces its signatory states to act. And yes, this includes bingo bango, US and China. This level of support that goes beyond individual nations inherently transcends their individual impetus to decide on their own policy. Gov needs to accept the alternative on their bench is to have no UCOP at all as a unifying factor among every nation, which looks like socialist Vietnam or even capitalist Venezuela not having any opt-in because there is no COP, because they have no buy-in when it's not there. Notice that you necessarily will not get any unifying sense of control on multiple states if you have no COP that unites them in the first place, because these nations are the ones who gave multinational corporations the platform to pollute. It means that these nations are necessarily the nations that should be held accountable. Theo proves beautifully that there is a need for the COP to exist to ensure that these standards for them to protect the environment are there, which is absent any incentive in Gov because you have no statutory policy to begin with. Because in Gov, even if the UN exists, the COP does not. Hell, the UN failed when the Cold War ensued because it did not stop economic war. But Gov Bench here says, even without the COP, they can go off because, hey, at least we have the UN. Bro, if you really want radicalism but also don't want failures, maybe, just maybe, Gov just doesn't want to exist. I didn't know this was a philo debate. Gov is just incapable of adhering to their burden because they want to take every single thing but never resolve how unipolar efforts will ever be better. But we engage further. Abed, clearly proves that radicalization is simply not feasible. On Gov, we prove that corporations will not follow if there is no COP. When the state of Brunei is calling out Ayala malls based in the Philippines, there's an impetus to call out the radicalization. So the environmental benefit that Brunei can get is less accessible now because the power imbalance will not be offset by any mechanism at all. Because in an idealized world of radicalism will not accrue, especially when you have multiple worlds for which the different states live in. Abed was quite clear that far-left values are viewed to be too extreme. He gave you a lot of structural reasons to prove this. It's not tangible to everyone, so it's much less likely to accrue if not everyone opts in. It's a policy that's forwarded only by the privileged, those who have the inherent capacity to handle financial shocks. So even if this means our policy is less radical by nature, we've proven why this is still good because you still have at least some delta of action that gives you some leverage to get action from these countries. But even if we buy everything PM gives, just me being very charitable, that they assume the fiat of improvement. Notice that we can co-opt that as well because no, Gov never proves to you why improvement is inherent to regretting the debate's existence. I'd argue that they aren't engaging in the median case that an average reasonable person would buy. They need to engage with a comparative, that you regret the COP in its entirety that Abed was quite clear proving. Deputy Prime here goes ahead and brings this blanket banner. We must target the root cause, the multinational corporations. Big words, but maybe they can square this debate all they want, but they unfortunately we see it entirely. If I buy their frame, then capitalism is the root cause. So your solution is to abolish capitalism. I think I know a couple of guys who attempted to do this, and they don't exist anymore right now, bro. You can figure what happened to these guys. Poland collapsed, Hungary collapsed, literally the biggest Soviet Union fell to the grave. All of them still returned to capitalism. So the likelihood that the best case alternative on God to accrue is just like very little. We were quite clear that radicalism, even its best form, has less buy-in because at least on our side with the COP, you still have some level of change. Oppose.
All right. Thank you for that speech. Opposition reply to end the debate. Gov reply.
Hi. Is this clear?
Yep, audible.
Perfect. Let's go back to basics. This house regrets debate. This is not this house would abolish the COP motion. So Theo and Adrian is pushing the wrong burden for government. We don't need to prove to you that the COP will be gone. We just have to regret it. If you actually read the Woodsy manual, then read better. Two pieces of standards. One, when do we principally regret something? From Adrian in LO, you were told that you do not have to regret the COP because it is the most democratic body of climate discourse. One, notice that if it is really democratic, then why does opposition have to deviate from the idea of putting so much scrutiny and criticism against them? This is why government wants to push for the regret or the scrutiny because it is aligned to the democratic principles of the COP. But second, Ahmed is lying to you when criticisms will still exist in their world because Prime Minister was perfectly explaining to you that their model in opposition is to celebrate the COP. This means that LO and DLO did not even prove why it is marginally exclusive for them that criticism will still exist. The celebration means that a lot of people will be apologetic of the COP and its failures. No engagement from up, they lose. It is only through PM and DPM where the metrics of regret is crystal clear if only the opposition listened carefully. You regret the COP when it has done the following things, and Prime Minister was perfectly clear about this. One, when it failed to put corporations in the chokehold to participate in the Cancún Agreement, but number two, when it failed vulnerable people in the retrospect based on the clarity and the implementation of their policies. Notice then again the lack of engagement from opposition here. This means that in the comparative of opposition, you validate the injustices and failures that the COP has done towards their inability to stop deforestation in Brazil from Prime Minister. You validate the COP's inability to push for accessible green initiatives in Southeast Asia and what have you. This means that by principle, we were crystal clear on the principle level alone that the regret is valid insofar as failure happened on the first place. There is absolutely no other thing. There's absolutely no better engagement from opposition. But secondly, and here's where we take opposition at their best because they're only purely pragmatic at their cases. We're the best forward climate action because this is where we analyze the net benefit and net harm if PU actually wants it to be a debate about that. The first layer here is on nation participation. LO said that the failure of implementing the Kyoto Agreement is not because of the COP, but it is because of the lack of participation from participating nations. Therefore, the COP shouldn't be regretted for their failures. I think one, Prime Minister is already clear that it is the failure of the COP it is the failure of the COP if they were unable to approach these nations carefully and actually tell them to participate, or if they were unable to incentivize them to participate. Again, that obviously, that obviously mitigates the harm off. But secondly, our standards for regret is fits this when the COP does not adhere to the paternal role to hold these entities accountable, to hold these nations and even corporations like Amazon accountable because of their inability to participate on like the Kyoto Agreement and what have you. Thirdly, right? I think if DLO pushes on the idea that people will have no incentive to listen, obviously you have to listen to the debate again. Second here is on checks and balances, and here is where it is more contentious. PO and Adrian tells you that all kinds of institutions have failed anyway. Wow. So we have to regret them all. I think this analysis is so funny because one, notice that opposition concedes that the COP is the best actor to forward climate change action. If this is true, then it is just right for government to put too much criticism against them compared to other entities and compared to other institutions. Insofar as our goal is to actually hold them more accountable and tell them to be more careful in their implementation of the Paris Agreement, for example. But number two, this is exactly why we even regret the UN when they failed to protect children in Gaza. Like, hello, I think it's already common sense. But as well, opposition tells you that the alternative is too radical, so buy-in is not true. Notice the misinterpretation of Abed in our case. The counterfactual in Gov is not to demonize people on the ground. The counterfactual is to demonize the COP itself, to regret it, and to criticize it. It was crystal clear from Prime Minister to DLO and DPM. This is only to the regret that we intensify the necessity of corrections and checks and balances. Obviously, the comparative is clear. Up is going to celebrate them. The lack of engagement is there. And obviously, the only way for us to make the COP better and to make the world a better place is if we actually regret the establishment. Thank you.
All right. Thank you for that speech, government reply. So with that in mind, the debate ends. Everyone, please cross the house. For the trainee,
Cross.
for the judge, let's proceed to room 19.
Thank you for the debate.
Shout out to Iggy.
Thanks for the
Shout out to Adrian Mango. Joke, it's Magno pala.
All right. So the way we will do the oral adjudication will go as follows. The first is I'll announce the call. Then after that, the trainee will give the oral adjudication. Then after that, me as the chair. So with that in mind, I just want to confirm, is L here in the room? L?
Hello, Chair. Am I audible? I'm here.
Yep, okay, you are here. All right, sige. I'll just announce the call then. All right, for the call, insofar I am the judge with only the voting power, I gave this win to side opposition. So I'll give my justification later. So the floor is yours, L.
Thanks, Chair. Hello, I'm just gonna set up my timer. Oh my god. I'm so sorry. It's lagging. Okay. Okay. Oh my gosh. Wait. Ah, what happened to my Wait lang. I'm so sorry guys. Like my mousepad isn't giving.
Hello, it's okay. I think we can wait naman. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Okay. I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. My speech will again go. My speech will goes as follows. First is I'm gonna talk about my general comments, and lastly the justification of my verdict. And also I gave this win to opposition. So firstly on my general comments, like basically I just like each teams needs just to show why, for example, their impacts are more significant or relevant than their opponents. This means that like they should basically impact their arguments in a way that emphasizes the importance of their outcomes based on like their criteria, especially on the standards of like the regrets motions, and also to, for example, to have like a greater magnitude time frame and basically the probability of like how is it like necessary it's regrettable or not, right? But secondly I think teams should compare the impacts directly, analyzing which impacts would affect more, like for example the vulnerable I mean the 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 actors, or like even the like how does it like last longer or happen sooner in terms of like this the sustainability at best, like they must you must get explain why, for example, those impacts matter more in the context of this round, and also the scarcity of like elevation in those impacts. I felt like in this debate it was extremely important for speakers to outline more impacts, because I felt like although arguments themselves were complete and very intuitive and very good, they have reached a deadlock because ultimately every argument led to the same conclusion, and that made it quite difficult, like for me, to break somehow that deadlock. And yeah, uh, and also, I think that would be all for my justification, and I will go directly with my justification, right? Okay, so auto my justifications then why, for example, opposition win this round over argument. Like they're just like two metrics that I'm gonna use in this round. Firstly, on the where can we get better accountability, a on the call out mechanism or pressure mechanism, but secondly on the, for example, the change on better burdening the policy, like green movements versus the collective efforts of the internal states to call out, for example, climate change, etc. Right? But secondly, on the metric, where can we champion better solutions on solving climate change, and on the, for example, pressure lead to like the importance of the regulating body, right? So in so far as like on the standards of like retro perspective state, what we get in this round is like we understand, like for example, COP at best, like for example, both consider is like it's like ensuring a plan so followed through, for example a discussion is it serves like coming from government that is a paternal objective service a beacon of hope, for example, and that these are like for example coming from a like basically the goal is just to like to set like implement policy that would basically approach to on or solve the, for example, the climate change problem, right? I think firstly on the issue of where can we get better accountability in terms of like the pressure mechanism on government side, basically it's very intuitive on them telling like for example with those problem of like of the COP on in terms of like the implementation is problematic because of, for example, it cannot like basically um s- create the solvency that they want to achieve at the end of the day, right? And also secondly, um I think the better they argue about on the ineffective the because of this, for example, the establishment of COP, it looks like, for example, solution mismatch that that leads to, for example, the ineffectivity of like solving the environmental problem, i.e. the climate change that is happening. And then this is not enough because the current world models, like we need, for example, a model that, for example, that cater alternative that would cater on the coordination of, like, for example, creating a better solvency on this problem, right? On the issue of accountability, I think government is very intuitive by telling us, like, they basically want, for example, because the presence of COP in of itself is something that it does not just like it's a solution mismatch, which means that only those, for example, those, for example, internal states are just like being held accountable and not direct on the biggest contributor of, like, for example, the carbon emissions and such, right? This means then that 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 absent, for example, this COP in and of itself, it will, for example, it will create a unique benefit. It will directly put accountability to this corporation, especially the MNCs corporation, the biggest contributor of these problems. And also it, like, for example, the COP in and itself is something like it gives lacking in a, like, not direct recognition of the problem on the climate change. That is why this is regrettable, right? Understand on the concern of, like, accountability under opposition. It's also very conversely, it's this is how, for example, they bank their ideas on how, for example, nations in and of itself are, like, they failed to achieve the set standard of the COP, because COP in and of itself is, like, for example, is a regulating body that further implement policies that could further, for example, that could somehow create solvency on the problem on the ground, right? Meaning the problem is that it's not just, like, for example, directing it to the, for example, this contributor, because it's a collective effort as well, because it's an internal state. Meaning there is also this standard that, for example, each states or nations still need to achieve at the end of the day, right? Meaning that the principle of, like, for example, developing nations should also be kind of like should be held also accountable in terms of, like, making change or making better agenda on the, for example, on the pressuring active on the mechanism, right? And it's better under opposition, because basically the pressuring mechanism is comparatively comparatively realized, because one, you have, for example, a traction that you need to keep at the end of the day, right? Meaning that traction, that support, that, for example, that does not just, like, for example, um kanang cater to this MNC, but also in the internal stakeholders as well, that, for example, that pressures this individual to be, for example, to follow the set standards at the end of the day. And I think in that in that notion, in that, like, framework, I think the framework of, like, opposition is basically in as an average reasonable person is more compelling. But secondly, in terms of, like, for example, the because, in absent the COP under government, their alternative is, like, for example, to create a radical solution and basically have, for example, these green movements to basically call for accountability for this MNC as well. And it will, for example, create pressure this COP to be better at the end of the day, right? If, for example, this will happen, this will, for example, create a better approach on solving these climate issues. I think that the collective efforts coming from the opposition by when they told us about the things there, for example, it's also about the internal stakeholders that should also, for example, um um have these values of, like, prioritizing to follow, for example, these kind of approaches at the end of the day, is implicitly recognizing the potential harms of the environmental problems. And at best, the massive reach and the unified the ratified organization or the ratified regulating body should be, like, supported by a lot of this internal study to have, like, for example, to have its legitimacy and to reach more than people if the issue is, like, to create awareness on the ground. But on the second issue, on, like, where can we champion better solutions on, like, solving climate change, this, for example, I think based on that, for example, the having a better accountability, I think the pressuring is there under opposition. in it's better because it's intuitive coming from them to tell us, like for example, there is like a better unified efforts coming from people, green movements on the ground and whatsoever to for example to further discussions and like to direct accountability on these things, right? I think they still need to answer the burden push coming from the opposition on basically how it's going to be like palatable absent, for example, this big regulating body. So like there is a burden push on how, for example, they are going to push for accountability absent COP at the end of the day, right? And what, like how this become palatable on the ground. And also this transcends to how, for example, catering the best in the interest of, for example, the corporations and even the people on the ground. By, for example, if like you have the COP in and of itself, there is like it's also feasible because, like for example, the framework in itself will, for example, help these multinational corporations to continue doing their like having this like jobs for people, for example, and this transcend to, for example, people being catered on the ground and like for example have privileges to at least at best even like put food on the table at the end of the day and not be associated with the, for example, that life values that and also create public support to appeal to the long term and short term for the for these environmental problem that is happening. So I think based on those things, I gave the win to opposition. So that would be all for my OA. Thanks much.
Alright, so yeah, so I think I am audible and I think all leads are here. Siguro just a general reminder. Don't forget to submit your feedback to the trainee. The next thing is that the OA will primarily focus on justification. So if you guys want points of feedback, points of improvements, feel free to message me after the round or after the OA rather. Setting up my timer. Game. 3, 2, 1. Go. So two things. The first thing is the decision. Second is the justification. So for the decision, again, as mentioned, this is an opposition win. I want to note that I won't be covering every claim that happened within the round, but I'm happy to answer questions if there are materials or other aspects in the debate that I didn't cover in the OA. So generally, in this debate, there's only one clash, which is where are we able to protect the environment? And the reason why this is the clash is because I think this is based on competing framework. This is what both teams care the most about. But in this clash, I think there are two sectors here, or there are two sub-clash. Particularly, the metric then on where we're able to protect the environment is based on one, the accountability that we're able to push towards to countries and towards to MNCs or companies. So how are we able to actually push them or up them into this case to actually care about the environment? And the secondary thing is the perspective of the developing countries on how we're all able to protect them. So let's start first with the accountability. So government enters within the debate by arguing that, you know what, COP retrospectively harms because it's a failure by virtue it only do tokenism actions or the fact that it's only a virtue signaling. Because one, it's too charitable to corporations. Second, it's not a real body, that it's just a convention. So it's hard to make countries to become accountable because you cannot put countries into jail. So that means they're able to opt out because it's the nature of international relations is that it's toothless. But the third thing is that how it basically puts other countries, such as Southeast Asian countries or in general developing countries, into a pedestal. Opposition engaged by arguing that the leverage of COP is that they are basically wider based since it's a UN ratified institution with a lot of signatories. So that means they have leverage of support, and that means as an extension, they also have a perceived legitimacy. So essentially, opposition tries to run a numbers game because there's a lot of buy-in already that exists. So that means developing countries has more ability to say by the nature of COP being democratic in nature. But secondly, this is where they're able to garner collective push against big polluters. So I think there are a lot of examples provided by opposition. So for instance, Paris Agreement, the fact that they're able to allow no smoke, particularly China in Taiwan Strait, etc. How did I weigh the exchange? Two things. The first thing is that I don't really see the overwhelming harm presented by government that it becomes the tipping point for the whole establishment of COP to be regretted. I think the first thing is that in terms of corporations, opposition was able to explain that corporations exist under a state. So if MNC then is based in China, so if there's already enough pressure, which opposition proved via the nature of COP, so that means China then has incentives to actually regulate and engage reforms, particularly to these industries. So I think that's one way they're able to engage on the MNC corporation discussion presented by government. The second thing is that in terms of developed countries, while I agree with government that these are not quote-unquote real body, i.e. they're social constructs created by different nation states, I think the mechanism presented by opposition is that the fact that there's still signatories of COP, that means they still have the legitimacy to actually push and pressure these countries in order to call them out and for them to change them at the end of the day. So I think government tries to argue that they are a social contract, hence it's harder for it to become accountable. But I think what opposition able to prove that it's a useful social construct because the fact that they agree or the fact that they're part of signatories here means they're able to leverage or at least they're able to position themselves to pressure these developed countries at the end of the day. The response coming from opposition government whip rather is to say that international relations is toothless in a legal sense. But I think opposition was able to explain that it's not about the legality of able to push them. It's about the social pressure that exists because of the existence of the COP by the very nature that it has a wider base that exists in status quo, that they're able to push support and they're able to call them out. So in essence then, I think opposition was able to prove that the net utility is worth it at the expense of the inefficiency or harms that exist in COP. The second thing then that I want to know is that while I agree and I'm vibes, with government trying to argue that, COP is actually imperfect. The reason why opposition still win is because I'm unsure on why the counterfactual is better. I think government presented a following counterfactual, which I'll going to present in this OA, and I'll explain why they're unable to win against opposition. The first thing that came as early as PM and as a response to the POI presented by the opposition is that, hey, we're going to engage in backlash and criticism against COP. So that means if we regret it, that means social movements are going to have more pressure against these corporations, against these nation states, against these individuals to actually speak out and for them to be consistent to their cause as the patriarch or as the patrimony of the beacon of hope in championing environmental rights. The reason why this doesn't work is because this House regrets motion debate. And I think there's a lot of confusion that happened in the round on what does regret actually mean. So if you want to read Woodsy manual, you're happy to do so. It's actually in page 26. But I want to note, and it's also evident in debate briefings, that the basic burden of a government team in any this House regrets motion is to explain the world what does absent X looks like. So in this particular case, this is the establishment of COP. So this means then that the world that government needs to defend is not only regretting that COP is bad or regretting COP has failed, but rather defending also a world where there's no establishment of COP and also explain the likely manifestations of that new world at the end of the day. So I think absence that, and by virtue of the wrong interpretation of what a regret motion calls for, I think this is where opposition was able to exploit the absence of proper counterfactual. Coming from LO, they explained that absence this, you're more likely going to generate smaller initiatives, which is bad because that means you have less manpower. It's harder for you to actually make developed countries to be accountable. Or coming from DLO, where they try to exploit which is a weird thing that they try to burden push government, which I don't necessarily buy, but they try to push that, it becomes a radical form of approach where they basically it's going to be harmful, which leads to backlash and economic harms that lead to unemployment and bankruptcy, which becomes detrimental to the government. But the point that I'm trying to make here is absence of counterfactual. It just casts a shadow of doubt then on the comparative of government and why the comparative is better in status quo where COP exists. But the second thing is that assuming that the claim coming from government is true, now we can put backlash and criticism against COP, then that also devalues the burden of government. Because if it is true that we can just put backlash and criticism against COP, and so even if COP fails to some extent, this backlash criticism analysis coming from Gov just proves that they can change, just proves that COP can also be improved, which debunks then the necessity of government to explain the necessity of the absence of COP. So that's the first counterfactual and the reason why that cannot work in order for them to win against opposition. The next thing, the counterfactual came from government, which particularly came from DPM and government whip, is that, hey, we need to target the root cause. And the root cause here are basically the MNCs. So the way we need to resolve this is via domestic jurisdictions so that different local states has their internal check and balance in nature to actually cooperate and hold these corporations accountable. The reason why this doesn't work are three things. The first thing is just by virtue of consistency rule. No? So if PM already explained the counterfactual, it would be unfair if I'm going to credit as well DPM's second counterfactual. So that cannot work at the end of the day. But two, even if I credit it, and because I don't want, debate to be stuck in technicalities, and I want to appreciate government's effort in this one, even if I credit that they're able to push domestic jurisdictions, one, I'm just unsure why is this exclusive on government? Because domestic jurisdictions or domestic pressures still exist on both sides. I'm unsure then what are the new changes that will happen in government and why these changes are comparatively better in the world where COP exists. But the third thing here is I think it wasn't that substantiated as much as I would have wanted to. So I think they try to assert that we're able to push domestic jurisdictions to actually force these companies. But my question in mind as an average reasonable person is like, one, what's the likelihood that these states are able to actually be the tipping point for corporations to change? If it is true in status quo, they don't change. And the second is that what's the extent of that benefit at the point at which you're able to actually engage in reforms? So the fact that there are a lot of missing questions or missing analysis makes it harder as well for me to credit the second counterfactual coming from government. So the conclusion then is simple. In a regret motion, while it talks about benefit on hindsight, it's also equally important that it's also a comparative debate absence of X. So with this in mind, while government team able to present some retroactive harms, I'm unsure why these harms, by virtue of positioning them within this certain debate, are the tipping point justification for an average reasonable person to regret the existence of COP. Even if there are harms that exist and they cannot be mitigated, I'm still unsure why the counterfactual of government is the comparatively better world. And due to absence of this based on what happened in the round, unfortunately, it reduces the persuasiveness level on why we should regret the COP. And insofar opposition was able to explain how COP has led to, for instance, check and balance, particularly to developed countries, with the fact that they're able to address the developing countries by virtue of the democratic nature of COP, I'm inclined then to believe that COP in net utility still does more good than harm. With all of those reasons, my decision stands. If you guys have any questions or clarifications, or again, if you want points of improvement, feel free to message me and feel free to message L as well. So yeah, all the best in next rounds.
Hello. So can opposition get PCs on voice like right now? Is it possible?
Yes, hold yeah, sure. Okay, let's go to Discord.
Okay, sige. Which one? Which Discord?
19?
19?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks, guys. All the best.